that a robust moral realism is accept the objectivity of it. So they don't have to reject they don't have to affirm objective morality. I mean, we can pull up the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy if you'd like. We can pull up the paper that Rosen's written on differentiating realism from robust moral realism and minimal moral realism that he wrote in 1994. You can go through it if you'd like.
I'm gonna look it up.
Go for it. But regardless, there are different ways you can have a discrete view. I mean, if you want to be happy about it, I can say I want it to be that it's whatever I think is the case right now. You can just make it discrete that way. You can time discrete it. There are many ways of discreting it to make it not just subjective but also anti-real. You can. I mean, there are many ways of framing it.
I don't know what time discreting is.
In other words, you can say it's whatever it's dependent on my views right now. So that's another way to frame it.
Right, but is the proposition true in virtue of your beliefs or not, or something?
Yeah, so you can frame it in terms of my beliefs right now, yeah, or in my particulars right now, or my principles right now. That's another way of framing it. You can say it's true in virtue of it's normative in virtue of my beliefs right now. And it's
I don't understand. Look, the substance of this, all of this just seems like obscurantism, right? And the reason it seems like obscurantism is because the question is very simple, but you're providing ridiculously complex answers to very simple questions. Either it's true, and everybody accepts this. This is like just this view is just that contradictions can't be true or something, right? Either it's true. Either moral propositions, if moral propositions are true, it's either the case that their truth value depends on your mentality, or it's not the case that their truth value depends on your mentality.
Yeah, that's a realist. That's saying what depends on the real, like a realist conclusion. If the normativity depends on your mentality, that would be objective subjective. Now if the truth value, if you're putting a truth value in there, you're talking about real normativity is just the type of claim that's being made. It's a normative claim. Yeah, and it can have a truth claim. Yeah, I understand. It's a claim that's being made and it can have a truth table. I understand what you're trying to say. And if it is, now the question is, if it is true that it is normative, in virtue of your values, right? Then essentially what you're saying is, well, we have to address two things. We have to address the objectivity of the question. We have to address the real anti-real nature of the question.
You just stipulated that it's not, by your stipulation, you said that it's not real because it's true in virtue of your values, right? And your values obviously depend on your mind.
Wait, hold on. That would make it subjective. Does it make it anti-real?
I mean, it seems like,
I think you're just conflating real. I actually think you actually do need to look this up now. I think you're continuing to conflate real, anti-real, and objective, subjective again.
Like, look, the other option.
I actually just think you should look it up. I'm sorry. I think you should look up Rosen.
Well, look. First of all, if you type moral realism in, and this is a standard view. If you just type moral realism into Google. You look at Wikipedia, it says moral realism is the position that ethical sentences express propositions which refer to objective features of the world, some of which may be true.
Wikipedia. That's nice. I'm not really interested. Let's look at either a Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy or the IEP, and you'll find actual philosophers writing on this. I'm not interested in Wikipedia. It's cute though.
Do you think that Wikipedia was written by people that are not actual philosophers? Like, it's just ridiculous.
Yes, I think there are plenty of people who are not philosophers writing on Wikipedia. Yes, but you're dead wrong on this. I don't know what to say. There's actual philosophers who clearly outline this difference.
Look,
and I can show. Would you like me to show you? I can show you. I mean, I don't know what to say other than like you're just factually wrong.
I'm happy. Look, I'm happy. I don't care whether or not philosophers agree about a view or whether a view exists, right? I don't care about that.
It's a category error you're making because of it, though.
I'm not making a category error because of it.
Real anti-real is not the same thing as objective subjective.
I'm just explaining what standard views are, right? Now, if there's some If you're saying there's some sort of esoteric philosophical view, I guess I believe you that there's some esoteric philosophical view.
Minimal moral realism is not an esoteric philosophical view. I don't know what you're saying.
It is. It seems proprietary.
Minimal moral realism is an esoteric philosophical view?
Well,
that's not true. I know JHC wouldn't have that view. That's got a lot of flair these days. You should probably look it up.
I just Googled it. I have nothing hitting up until maybe the 6th shirt on Reddit. I found it on Reddit.
Minimal moral realism. The difference was actually outlined as far as 1994.
I found it on Wikipedia.
It was published in the Journal of Philosophy of Mind.
I found it in Wikipedia. Robust versus minimal moral realism. But that's
Thank you.
But that's on Wikipedia. Those are not
okay.
Real philosophers.
That's fine. I don't listen. That's cool. That's great. Let's go. I still maintain the position that we should go to the actual primary literature and not Wikipedia. But if you want to go to Wikipedia, be my guest. I still maintain, just for the sake of being as pure as possible about this, and not to go to the primary literature that would make the distinction. But yes, it's important to know the distinction between minimal moral realism and robust moral realism.
So you're saying that the minimal model of moral universalism leaves off metaphysical thesis, treating it as a matter of contention among moral realists as opposed to between moral realists and moral anti-realists. This dispute is not insignificant, as acceptance or rejection of the metaphysical thesis is taken by those employing a robust model. So you're just saying that there's either a metaphysical backing to moral propositions, like moral Platonism is true, or it's not the case that moral Platonism is true?
A minimal moral realist doesn't have to affirm moral objectivism. Is the fundamental difference.
Well, I don't think that anything that a moral realist. So I think that you're actually confused. And I think the literature would show that you're confused on this. I think that it's objective.
Okay, let's go to the literature then. That's fine.
Yeah, so I think that it's objective, but I think that there are moral realists who deflate the. I think there are more moral realists that deflate the ontological status of moral propositions, just like they deflate the ontological status of mathematics, right? But they still think it's true independent of minds. Moral realism is the thesis that it's true mind independently. They still think they're objective. They just think that it's clear, like what I'm reading here, that they just think that.
Where are you reading exactly?
Well, I just think the view here is no. I'm not reading that it is objective, but I'm reading what the view is, and moral realism as the view that moral truths are true, independent.
Moral realism.
Look, where's your source? Let's just go with.
That's fine. I'll dig up. That's fine. I'll dig up the source for you. That's fine, buddy.
But anyway, all of this stuff I take to be immaterial because I asked a simple question, right? And this simple question I asked was, are the propositions true, regardless of whether they're real or not, right? Which I'm not taking to be objective in this case, right? Are the propositions true depending on what you believe or not? And you were saying, I want it to be the case that moral propositions are not true if I think that they're true. That is to say, they're true irrespective of what I believe about the truth of them. And those were your words, right? And so whether or not you want to call that an anti-realist position, it's still an objectivist position, right? Because even if you were correct that it's not a realist position, as in the way I'm explaining the view, that there's nothing metaphysical grounding moral propositions, nothing metaphysical grounding the truth of moral propositions, it still depends on something other than the mental, which makes it objective.
Yeah, I understand. Now, the truth value, yeah. So the truth value, well, actually, I may argue it's the other way around. You could be a minimal moral realist and reject the objective nature of it. But yeah, so the normativity of it, one way to say is it's not mind dependent, but the other way to say it is that I right now have a mind dependent view that I don't want to have, that I don't want my views. I don't want to have my principles or particulars basically to, or basically. I mean, I see what you're saying. You can say you can say it's not realist, but it would be some form of objectivism, or you can say that it's normative. The views I have are. Let me just try to find a way of explaining this as clearly as I can. So, is it
what's
possible?
the source that you're using?
Oh,
what's
yeah.
source
Sorry.
that
Let
you're
me.
using?
Yeah, you want? That's fine. Well, we can do it too. Oh, yeah. Let me get my source. That's fine.
Send it to me in PM.
I'll post it in the general. Let's see. Hold on. Minimal moral realism.
Avi, it says here that moral universalism is the same thing as minimal realism. Is that correct?
Where does it say that?
According to the let me get the source. According to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Minimal moral realism is the same thing as universalism.
Moral universalism. Yep.
Moral universalism. I'd have to see that.
Okay.
My understanding from what I've read is that the difference between a robust moral realist and a minimal moral realist is a robust moral realist would reject things like non-cognitivism, error theory, and subjectivism. Whereas a minimal moral realist would reject things like non-cognitivism, error theory, but they wouldn't necessarily reject subjectivism.
Yeah, so I don't think that that's true. The reason I don't think that that's true is because it's talking about a metaphysical issue, right? And so if we make this analogous to realism about the truth of mathematics, right? Like you can have a realist view and you can have an anti-realist view. Like you have a nominalist view about mathematics, but that doesn't mean. Look, if you have a nominalist view, those nominalists, even though they don't think that there's a metaphysical grounding for mathematical propositions, they think they're simply true in virtue of the meaning of the words. Like at least a lot of nominalists tend to think that, but they still think that those propositions would be true independently of whether or not anybody believed them. And so I think
Yeah. Well, the view I'm trying to get at is that the views may not exist without my mind. So the views may not exist, but if someone were to instantiate those views, if a mind would exist and instantiate those views, then those views would be normative. And it doesn't matter which mind instantiates those views. There are certain mind-dependent views that, if instantiated, are simply normative irreducibly.
I want to read this paper that you're talking about.
Yeah, let me find it. It's just I'm trying to explain. We'll find it at the same time.
I think I've almost found it.
Let's see. It was published in the Journal of Philosophy of Mind. Let's see. It might be the IEP, actually. It might not be from Stanford. Okay, let's see. I think this is it. Yeah, Rose in 1994. Okay. In defense of distinguish minimal moral realism, which denies 1, 2, and 3. So what are 1, 2, and 3? 1 is moral non-cognitivism, 2 is moral error theory, and 3 is moral non-objectivism. So minimal moral realism denies 1 and 2, but it does not necessarily deny 3, which is moral non-objectivism. A robust realist denies 3, which is also moral non-objectivism. So that's Rosen 1994. Here's the source. Hold on. So I'll first post the article where I'm getting this from. This is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And I'm posting that in general right now. Here's the specific source. Here, Objectivity is in Modern Idealism, What is the Question? By Rosen 1994, published in Philosophy of Mind. Now, this is what really started getting minimal moral realism a lot of flair. When the minimal moral realists broke off from the robust moral realists.
I guess if you were an idealist, you would have to think that moral propositions are true in virtue of being thought to be true. But what you were saying was what you were saying was antithetical to that, right? Because you were saying that you wanted things, you wanted it to be the case that the truth of some proposition didn't depend on what you believed at the time.
Yeah, the normativity of the proposition didn't depend on what I believed about the normativity, but the existence of the normative proposition would depend on my mind. That's the distinction I'm trying to draw.
So I'm not following that.
Okay, so some propositions can exist in a mind. So, for example, if there were no minds, there would be no moral propositions. So if there were no minds in the world, then there would be no moral views. There would be no moral thoughts. There would be no moral propositions. So it's in the sense of its existence, it's mind dependent. That being said, there are certain subjective, all of these possible subjective views, if we did introduce a mind into the universe, there are certain concepts, these concepts and all these different normative concepts, not all of them are going to be normative, and the normativity of it is just irreducible. So the existence would require the instantiation of these concepts, these thoughts, would be mind dependent. If there were no minds, there wouldn't be any thoughts of these things. But some of the normative status of these thoughts, even though their existence is mind dependent, then this normative status would just be irreducible. You can make a case would not be mind dependent in that sense. But the existence of those propositions would be mind dependent.
I just don't understand. I just don't understand what view you're trying. Like when you say you reject the fluid view, it's something along the lines of you don't want it to be true that if you believe some moral proposition, then that moral proposition is true. That's what you're saying?
The best way to say it, really, that's one way of saying it. The real way of saying it is, if at a later date I changed my view and wanted to justify a Holocaust. Like, here's fundamentally what I don't want. Like, I'll just say it. If at a later date, which is not this date, if at a future time, in my view, my principles changed or my particulars changed, and I wanted, and to justify a Holocaust, I want to have a view right now which says that would be wrong, and the fact that I changed my principles, it would still be wrong even if I changed my principles or changed my particulars.
So it sounds like what you're saying is that you want the moral propositions that you believe now to be true, regardless of whether you believe them.
The normative status, sure. Their existence could be mind dependent, but the normative status.
When you say the normative status, I don't really understand what that's adding. The propositions are normative just in virtue of their content, right? So it's normative because it's a prescription, it's an ought, right? So what are you talking when you say that you don't want their normative status to change? Are you saying that you want propositions that are normative to still be normative, even if you don't believe those propositions are true? Because that just seems like that's saying I want true things to be true. A normative proposition is going to be a normative proposition under all circumstances, right? Because of the content of the proposition. So you're saying, so that's going to be true anyway, right? That's just trivial. That's just saying P is P. A normative proposition is a normative proposition. I don't know that's what you're saying that you want?
I want the normative propositions. There are certain normative propositions that I want. And I want those normative propositions. And I want it to be that I want a system. Here's fundamentally what I want.
I don't understand, when I said you're saying that you don't want your views to change, and you're saying, no, I'm not saying that. Why? Why aren't you just saying?
Well, I do. It's true. That's true. That may be true too. I may not want my views to change as well. But what I really want fundamentally is I want at least to have a view now that if my views did change in the future. So imagine me seeing a crystal globe. If I see my views changing in the crystal globe in the future, and I'm just slaughtering everyone, I want to be able to say, whether it's an objective view or a subjective view or a real view or an anti-real view, whatever it is, I want to be able to look at it and say, I think that's wrong, or that's wrong. Whether it's subjective, objective, real, anti-real, I want to look at that and say that's wrong. That's fundamentally what I want.
Yeah, but all you're saying is that there are things that you think are wrong right now. I mean, it wouldn't matter because... that's all you're saying is that there are things that you think are wrong. You can imagine yourself doing things that you think are wrong.
Yeah, but if I have the view that if things are wrong only by virtue of me affirming that things are wrong, and if my views can change, it would still be wrong. It would no longer be wrong if my views change. If the truth maker of the normativity is just my views, the issue I would take is that basically what that's saying is right now you shouldn't be looking at the crystal globe and saying that's wrong. You should actually be looking at the crystal globe and saying it's right. It's right if we were to go to that time point, because in that time point, my view is that these things are right.
I think that the analogy is probably causing a lot of confusion. Because it seems like you're dissociating yourself from yourself, and you're just saying something that maybe shares my bodily characteristics is engaging in actions which I don't think are right, And so you're just saying that...
I mean, I exist at different time points, right? Like if you would imagine a block time, maybe a B theory of time. If you imagine a block time, I would exist at different points in time.
What I'm saying is I think that the whole analogy is confusing you. And the reason I think it's confusing you is because when you're doing that, all you're saying is that your body is doing things that you currently think are wrong. The you at that time doesn't think that they're wrong, right? So,
but if you have a view, if your view is that what determines if something is right or wrong is just if you hold the view that it's right or wrong. It's just you believe it to be right or wrong, and that determines if it's right or wrong.
Look, so obviously both the times can't be happening at the same time, so you can't view the crystal in the way, because then you would just believe it's wrong and not wrong.
Yeah, but you can believe it to be wrong now and not wrong in the future, even looking at the crystal globe now. You can say this action of slaughtering people is wrong right now. Right now, I don't hold the view slaughtering people is wrong. But in the future, now that I see that I'm going to change my view in the future, the action of slaughtering people is not wrong because I do not hold the view in the future that the action of slaughtering people is wrong. That's not P and not P. There's no contradiction.
You do hold that view in the future. But you do hold that view in the future. That's stipulated by your hypothesis.
No,
So
what I'm saying is that if let's say you found out that you would change your view in the future, whether that's because you got a brain tumor, whether that's because you have some degenerative, it doesn't matter. You changed your view in the future and you want to slaughter a bunch of people. Now, if you have a view that says things are right or wrong because of whatever I view at any time point that things are right or wrong, and they would be right or wrong with respect to the time point that I'm affirming it. So if
But look, so the reason I think that you're getting confused is because if you were to look at the crystal globe, that means the two actions are happening simultaneously. Like you're seeing yourself perform actions, and you're saying that
doesn't mean they're happening simultaneously.
Well, I don't understand what. So you're viewing something. You're not presently viewing something, or you are.
Do you think there's something? Do you think like different times have to simultaneously exist for you to be able to be aware of something in the future?
I think that in order for you to be viewing the crystal ball, that would be happening in the present. And if that you in the crystal ball is doing things, then that you is doing things presently, just like you watching yourself is present. That's what I think. It
doesn't have to act. Listen, no, it's just like the reason I'm giving a crystal globe is just, it's not to say that these things are actually happening. It's just to say like here's information on what your view would be in the future. That's all it is. That's all the point of it is.
So if someone says to you, in 10 days, you're going to believe it's moral to slaughter animals, right? If someone said that to you, you're saying that right now you don't want that to be true, that in 10 days my view is to slaughter animals. Or you don't want it to be true that if it were true that my view is that it's moral to slaughter animals, then it is in fact true that it's moral to slaughter animals. That's what you're saying. You don't want it to be true. So it's like
what I'm saying.
So it sounds like what you're saying.
What I was trying to say is that if you have a view that whatever I believe is normative is whatever I believe is right, that's what makes it right because I believe it to be right. Let's take that view and run with it. If you have that view, then can you mute your mic, Tusip? Tui sup. I'm just gonna mute you.
Yeah, I mean, I know what you're gonna say, but it just sounds like you're objecting.
How about you tell me what I'm gonna say then, so we're on the same page.
Okay, you're about to say if you have the view that if a moral proposition is true in virtue of you believing that moral proposition, then at the time of you believing a contradictory moral proposition to what you believe currently, that it's then right.
No. I mean, okay. No. It's not. I don't view it as a contradiction at all. I mean, it's a contrary moral proposition, but it's not happening at the same time, right? And we both are on the same page on that, right? So what you would.
It doesn't matter if it happens. Look, the propositions are contradictory at all time. You oughtify and you not oughtify. Those two propositions are contradictory. So if you believe that you oughtify at time t, and at time t1 you believe that you ought not to phi, those two propositions are contradictory regardless of what time they happen.
That's only if your moral proposition is you ought to phi at all time points.
Look,
it's
propositions.
The proposition doesn't inherently say anything about what time span the ought covered. So if you want to say your proposition is you ought to phi at all points t, then I would agree.
It's part. It's part. That's why. Look. Oh my God, this is so. Look. So all right. So conditionalize it that way. You believe currently that at all times t, it's immoral to phi, and at time t1 you believe that at all times t, it's moral to phi. How about that? So we've just conditionalized.
Those would be two contradictory. Those would be two contradictory propositions.
So we've just conditionalized that worry away, which was nothing but pedantry. And I think that I was accurate when I characterized your view. And I like, you didn't want it to be true. You didn't want it to be true that I already knew what you were going to say. So you added that little bit of pedantry in there.
No, that's not why I added it. That came after. But okay, you can. I don't really care about the meta of the conversation. Anyway. You have a familiar. By the way, you have a familiar voice. Do I know you from another server?
Yeah. So where are you going?
Where do I know you from?
I'm in like 8 servers.
Oh, does your name begin with an S?
No.
But where do I know you from? No, you have a familiar voice. Where have I ran into you before?
You probably run into me on YouTube or the politics server.
Probably the politics server. What's your name there?
Calliopean Club. I'm incredulous stare on all of these in all of these rooms.
I thought I recognized your voice somewhere. But anyway, okay, yeah, no, I mean, I'm trying to I'm trying to actually be genuine here, but no, I mean, I would agree, yeah. So so my issue would be that if you have a view that at all points time t, that you ought not to phi. And then you also have a view that the truth value of you ought not to phi is dependent on your belief that you ought not to phi at any point time t. Then what's not making sense to me is if you change your view, then it seems contradictory for your view to change. Because if your view changes, then then you're affirming that it would be true if you changed your view to you ought not to phi, even though you at all points time t, even though you currently have a view that it's true to phi at all points time t.
Wait, I have a quick question. Do you actually believe that you I'm assuming that you hold the view that you ought not rape for someone for just mere pleasure, right? I'm assuming you have that belief.
Mm-hmm.
I do. Now, would you say that that's only in certain specific times, or do you think that would cover a span of all time?
In the context of if it's just for fun, yeah, I would say it would be for all time.
Right.
Yeah.
So, but you're not comfortable with the idea of having a contradictory belief there, right?
Yeah, so that's what I'm saying. If it's where the contradiction comes from.
So the conditional of the time is not necessary.
Well,
you don't hold the oughts in relation to certain specific times.
No, I mean, if I can say, well, you one way to get out of the contradiction, which is the way I don't get out of the contradiction. Yes, I agree. In my view, that's not how I get out of the contradiction. I'm saying I'm just steel manning as much as possible. One way someone can get out of the contradiction is saying I ought not to rape at the points in time at this point in time through this point in time. So they can say if my view changed, it wouldn't be encapsulated by that point in time.
We're talking about your view.
It's not. No, it's not my view. No, I'm just making it as steelman as I can. The other way to get out of the contradiction is to say that the truth value of the truth value of the normative claim that you ought not to rape at all points time is not dependent. It's not in virtue of you affirming it. That's another way to get out of the contradiction. Now, I don't see a way. Can you find another way to get out of the contradiction?
So, like, what the argument that you're forwarding sounds similar to the argument for moral infallibility that's raised against subjectivists, right? So they're saying that at all points in time, you're morally infallible. So there's an issue there, right? Like moral subjectivists then can't make moral progress, and if it's true that they can't make moral progress, well, I guess it's just decidedly objectionable that they can't make moral progress. So if you believe that you can in fact make moral progress, then that shows that subjectivism is false. That's what it sounds like. The argument that you're characterizing. So it sounds like you're arguing against moral subjectivity.
In terms of the normative sense, I guess you can frame it as an argument against moral subjectivity. In terms of the proposition's existence, not sure. But one thing I want to clear up on that, it seems like there's a contradiction to be had. It seems like if you want to say at all, it seems like there's here's what I can even let me see if I can just spell out the contradiction. So the contradiction would be let P be the view that you ought to phi at all points time t. Okay, and let A be the view that the truth of the normative status is dependent on you affirming the normative status. And then you can say the not P would be you ought not to phi at all points.
I think you're going too far into the weeds with this. Like, your objection is simple, right? Like, all you're saying is that if the truth of moral propositions depends on what you believe, then if you believe that it's moral to phi at all times t, then it's true that it's moral to phi at all times t. But then at time t1, you believe that it's immoral to phi at all times t. Then it's true that it's immoral to phi at all times t. And then that means that
that's a contradiction.
In the same sense and in the same way, it's moral to phi at time t, and it's immoral to phi at time t. That's all you're saying.
Yeah, and it seems, so if you combine those three views together, it's moral to phi at all times t, it's immoral to phi at all times t, and the truth value of the normative status of phiing or not phiing is dependent on you affirming it. It seems if you combine those things together, then unless any change in your view is a contradiction. That's what I'm saying. It seems to me like if you hold those three views in combination, unless you maintain the same view throughout all points time t, you're running into a logical contradiction, P and not P.
Yeah, that's true. What you're saying is true. It sounds like it's an argument against moral subjectivism on the assumption that you can change your beliefs, your moral beliefs.
Yeah, maybe it is. Yeah, I have to think about it. But but conceptually that is what the issue I'm seeing.
But I mean, if you just didn't conditionalize the time, the times, then your views could change, and then the moral propositions would just be true, right?
Oh yeah, I mean, look, you could, right, like I said, one way of getting around it is saying, well, you ought to phi, and that's not at all times t. You can say, well, I ought to phi at time t 1 second to t 5 seconds, and as long as I don't change, and my view changes, as long as my view doesn't change within those 5 seconds, then it's not a contradiction. That you can get out of the contradiction that way. It seems like there might be other issues with that, because like it's saying like, oh, you only ought to, like I only ought to not rape at from points t equals 0 to t equals 5 seconds from now. I mean, it seems kind of, I mean, you can do that. It gets out of the contradiction, but it won't get out of the contradiction if your view changes in the next 5 seconds. But then what's your a couple of issues with that? What's your view after the next 5 seconds? Is it you ought to rape or ought not to rape, ought to phi, ought not to phi? And then how much time does that last for? And if you run into the same issue, like, okay, well then I'll ask the same question. Do you hold the view that you ought to phi has the truth normative value in virtue of you affirming it or not? And if it does, then well, how many more seconds do you want that to last for?
Well, that doesn't really matter, right?
Well, I mean, it just seems like I can keep asking the same. Do you hold the same three things over and over for all times t? And basically, it just seems very. I mean, well, it's not irrelevant because as long as they're affirming the three things over.
It is irrelevant.
Oh, okay. I mean, it is, well, in that sense, yeah. But well, the problem. Oh, here's the non-relevant problem. The non-relevant problem would be it seems very weak for someone to say. Most people want to be able to say you ought to phi or ought not to phi at all times t. People don't want to say it's wrong to slaughter everyone. It's wrong to slaughter everyone, but only for the next 5 seconds. Like, most people don't want to have a view like that. It seems kind of silly.
Well, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter.
No, I get it. I'm not trying to show a logical contradiction now. I'm not.
The reason I'm saying it doesn't matter is because that's just how the average person thinks. They're just saying, right now, I think it's wrong to X, right? And it doesn't matter what X is. They're saying, right now, I think it's wrong, and I don't have a time. Like I'm not saying I think it's wrong for some time frame. Right now, I think it's wrong to X. That might change. It might be wrong. I think it's time to X. Now that's another
fine.
argument.
That gets out of the contradiction. I understand. Yes, taking away the time, taking away all points time t gets out of the contradiction. I get that. I understand.
No, but I'm not merely saying that. I'm saying that most people are just reporting their current values. They're not reporting on their values in the future, and they're not stipulating it. Most people are not stipulating a time frame on how long they're going to last.
No, so, it's not about no. Now it's not about how long their views are going to last. They're saying the question is right now. The question is right now. Do you have the view that it is wrong to rape for all points time t? Do you have the view that it is wrong to rape now and it's wrong to rape in the future, and it's wrong to rape an hour in the future, and it's wrong to rape a year in the future, and it's wrong to rape 2 years in the future? Like, is that your view?
Yeah, but I'm just saying, if a person responded to that, my only view is it's wrong to phi now.
Yeah, no, they can say that. That's fine. If someone wants to say it's wrong to phi now, and that's all I can say, and I'm agnostic on if it's wrong to slaughter and can commit a Holocaust 1 second in the future. If they want to say that, that's fine.
Well, I mean, like, you don't have to be again. So this again is the moral infallibility argument about that moral realists usually wage against subjectivists, right? The moral realists usually say to subjectivists, well, you can't make moral progress, so you can't say I could be wrong about my moral intuitions. But if you're a moral realist, you can say something like, well, I could make moral progress, and it's intuitive to people to say, well, I might think it's right to phi now, but when I wake up in the morning, I might be acquainted with some moral property such that I realize that it's in fact false that I ought to phi, And so what the objection that you're characterizing is typically an objection against moral subjectivism.
I don't care about the notion of progress or not. My issue is just, it seems like I'm between a rock and a hard place. And the rock is, do I run into a contradiction? And the hard place is, do I lose the ability to say? The hard place is, do I lose the ability to say that it is wrong to phi at all points time t? That's I just want to see if that's the situation I'm in. Am I in the situation where I'm between a contradiction, a logical contradiction, and between losing the ability to say it is wrong to phi at this domain of time t? Do I have to restrict my affirmation of it's wrong to phi to the Planck second or to a very small discrete time frame? Because both of those positions seem very.
And so,
like, I don't care about the notion of progress or not. We can get into the argument.
The response from the moral realist is that no, there's no contradiction. That if I were to say at time t1 it's immoral to phi, and at time t2 to say it's moral to phi, if that doesn't depend on my mental states, then the moral realist can say, yes, I can still quantify over all times, and yes, I can change my view without contradiction. So it just seems like you're saying that the way to resolve the rock and the hard place issue is to be a moral realist.
In the normative, so that's the problem I'm having right now, it seems. Or at least to affirm at least a minimal moral realist position, and not a complete subjectivist position. You can say that the existence of the normative propositions are subjective, but the truth, the normative aspect of certain mind-dependent propositions, their normative status would not depend on you affirming it, or would not depend on you instantiating it. If you have that view, then it seems you get out of the contradiction. Now, is there a way for the subjectivist to get out of... Now, here's what I want to know. Is there a way for the subjectivist to get out of the contradiction while also affirming that it is moral to phi at all points time t? That's the $1 million question I'd like to know.
I mean, I don't have a view on that. Like, you'd have to just analyze the quantification over time. What you think about that, right? That's sort of what it depends on.
Well, I know my question is: can a subjectivist say? Can a subjectivist say that I affirm it is moral to phi at all points time t? I also affirm that the truth value of being or not being moral to phi is dependent on me affirming it, and I also affirm that it is okay for me that if I change my view, I am not right now employing a contradiction. Like, can a subjectivist get out of this problem?
I don't see a way of them doing it.
Right. So, I mean, you could just look at your view of time. If you thought that only the present moment, like say if you thought the present moment had a particular ontological status that other moments in time don't have, then you might say that the propositions could only be true in the present moment and false at other moments. So every moral proposition, because it doesn't have a referent that's not referring to the current moment, could be false, would have to be false. But the moral propositions uttered where their content is the present would have to be true, and it would be true simply in virtue of being thought.
But it just sounds like the subjectivist is no longer saying it's not more moral to phi at all points time t then.
Well, you could argue that you couldn't make temporal predication. That's the response I'm saying, is that those things wouldn't have a truth value.
Oh, that it's just a non-cognitivist approach with respect to all points time t?
Not all points, because obviously
or other points other than the present time t just have this non-cognitivist approach?
I mean,
that sounds hilarious.
That sounds kind of that sounds really weird.
Well, no. See, I think what I'm saying is that you might say that they're false because at those times they're not believed, right? Because the only time where believing is happening is the current time.
Well, no, you believe things in the future, do you not? I mean,
well, I'm saying that the future doesn't have an ontological status, so it doesn't have...
Oh, so you're basically saying you're affirming the A theory of time.
I'm giving an option. Like, you were looking for an option for subjectivists. I'm just...
So let's see if rejecting the B theory of time, which is something like I don't think any person who ascribes to like holding to value of the scientific consensus of physicists and whatnot should do, but let's say if someone wants to reject the scientific consensus and affirm the A theory of time over the B theory of time, does that actually get out of the contradiction?
Well, I think that the B theory of time, I mean, just to clear up some confusion there, I don't think that B theory of time generates predictive expectations, so I don't think that I mean, I take those to be metaphysical theses, not physical theses. So I don't think that there's any observation that's compatible with A theory that's incompatible with B theory.
Really? When physicists always represent time as in this block time view, and they say that that's most compatible with general relativity. Like, what's the error that all these physicists are making?
I think that they are probably scientific realists.
Okay, and so basically, so your view is that, I'm just trying to understand your view on time. So your view on time is that the future doesn't have an ontological status. The future doesn't actually exist, and the past does not exist.
I don't have a view on time. I'm a content.
Okay. So if someone wants to say that the future doesn't exist in the past, well, again, so now what I'm saying is that if someone wants to affirm the view that the future doesn't have an ontological status, it's not like a meaningful thing to say when you're talking about the future, and the past doesn't have an ontological.
Look, I'll try to explain it this way. At non-existent times, those propositions are not believed, right? And they're not believed in virtue of the fact that there's no existent time, there's no existent believer. So there's no moral proposition that's true at that time, right? At non-existent times, there's no moral proposition that's true at that time. So
it just sounds like this is another way for this of saying the subjectivist is no longer saying it's normative or not normative to phi at all points time t.
Well, you just have to look at what's going on. I mean, I think the idea there is that you'd have to look at what's going on when you're referring to future or past times. Then you'd have to have some sort of view about what countenances your notions of.
Yeah, whatever their counts or notions is. Like if the subjectivist says it's wrong to phi at all points time t, if they assert that, and they also assert whether it is moral or not moral to phi at all points time t depends on me affirming if it's moral or not moral to phi at all points time t, and they would change their view in the at a different point time t, whatever your conception of time t is, at a non-current point of time t right now, they would change their view. It seems like this is a logical contradiction, and changing the view on what time t means, we would just have to change the view on what time t means for the first affirmation of the premise it's wrong to phi at all points time t to match it up. So I don't see this as getting out of a contradiction. Maybe I'm missing something.
Yeah, I think that you're missing the fact that those propositions at those times are not believed. And so that's the point. That if the truth of those propositions depends on your belief, and there is no believer at any other times, then those propositions can't be true. So like you might just say that there's a mistaken quantification, or maybe something phenomenological is happening with a subjectivist of that type.
Yeah, I mean, then if I were to say that I was going to eat breakfast tomorrow, what I said would be just completely false, right? That seems ridiculous. Like clearly, when I say I'm going to eat breakfast tomorrow, I'm referring to something.
Well,
something that's true.
I don't know a lot. I mean, I don't know a lot about A theory. I don't really study philosophy of time. But I think that atheorists have views about tenses, and the tensed propositions are true. So they think that the tensed proposition is true, but that when the tense changes, there's future tense and then there's past tense, and so they think that when the tense changes, let me think about it. I haven't read about A theory in a really long time. I have to look it back up. But I know that they think tense matters to their view. Let me just look it up.
Right, well, what you said is just a way of saying that it is not true that I ought not to rape at all times t. That would turn saying at all times t into a kind of useful fiction, not something that was actually true, but just something that we had in our language for pragmatic reasons, right? So that's just a way of losing any meaningful statement about morality.
No, I think the idea is that they're tensed truths. That's the whole point, is that they're tensed truths, but the tense changes. And so when the tense changes, the tensed propositions are still true. It's just that the tense has changed.
I'm not following that.
Yeah, I mean, didn't you earlier say that it wouldn't be true at any time t for somebody to believe that rape was wrong?
The original affirmation is that it's wrong to phi at all points time t, whatever the fuck that means. Whatever time t means, it's wrong not to phi at all times t. Now, how do we get out of the contradiction? Help! I don't see it. Maybe I'm just not following it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a pretty clear contradiction to me. I don't see a way out of it.
Anyway, should we move on with do we want to keep going on this, or do we want to move on to the more realist views of generalism and particularism?
I do want to hear about that, actually, because I'm not familiar with like the formalities of that at all, but I think that's probably closer to what I actually believe.
Are you guys moral objectivists now? If you think,
well, I have to think about how to get out of the contradiction. I'm gonna think it over. I'm gonna take. I don't just like do an armchair philosophy thing and just flip over. I mean, I want to try to steel man the subjectivist as much as possible. If I do go a realist, it would probably be like I would try to go as minimal realist as I can because that's my bias. But I need a way to get out of this contradiction.
Wait, are you a moral subjectivist, Abby? I thought you were an error theorist.
No, I'm not an error theorist.
Oh, so you actually hold it to be normatively true that rape is wrong because you believe that it's wrong?
No, I that's what I'm saying. I don't want to have that view. I don't want to have the view that rape is wrong because I believe it's wrong.
So, wait, what's your view then?
I guess now I'm just between a rock and a hard place and trying to figure it out because I've come to this problem and I don't see a way out of it.
Yeah, I mean, there's other issues with moral subjectivism, by the way. Another problem is that it doesn't make any sense of moral disagreement. So suppose that I think it's wrong to abort and you don't. Apparently, it is true that we should and should not abort, which is just ridiculous, right?
Unless you get rid of unless you hold like a error theory or something like
but then that's not moral subjectivism.
Yeah, it's not moral subjectivism anymore. Yeah.
I mean, error theory also is weird with moral disagreement, right? So
I mean, error theory needs to be steelman because, like, the basic version of error theory actually just explodes.
Oh, why's that?
Yeah. So let's say we have murder. So error theory basically just says moral propositions have truth tables and the value is false. And they're all false. So let's do it like this. So let's say murder is wrong equals false, according to an error theorist. And murder is not wrong is also false, according to an error theorist. And let's say we're just holding the binary theory of truth. We're not going to a gradated theory of truth or anything like that. So if they say murder is false, they say murder is